Far from Home, written by Gabriel Ndayishimiye. Chapter 2. Trying to Get It Right. You're home before you know it. The stairs creak like they're going to give out, and the hall smells like fried oil from the chip shop downstairs. You step over the broken tile near your door and fumble with the key until it clicks. Inside, it's dark and stale. You kick off your wet shoes and shrug off your coat, draping it over the back of the chair. The windows half open, and the wind's blowing the curtain around like a ghost, trying to get in. You don't bother closing it. You stand there for a minute, looking at the stack of papers on the table, the ones you meant to sort through weeks ago. Old bills, letters, crumpled notes you wrote to yourself at 3 a.m. when your head was buzzing too loud to sleep. You pull out the chair and sit down, letting your hands rest on the table. You feel the cold from outside creeping in, but you don't move. You stare at the blank sheet of paper in front of you, like it's some kind of challenge. The thought's been gnawing at you since you left the library. You can't stop seeing Khalid's face, lit up and strong, standing there like some kind of monument to resilience. It's not his fault. You know that. He's just doing what he has to do. But it eats at you, and you don't know why. Or maybe you do, and you just don't want to admit it. You pick up the pen and tap it against the paper, once, twice, trying to find the words, trying to make sense of why it feels like betrayal. Or maybe it's not betrayal. Maybe it's just jealousy or shame. You can't tell anymore. You haven't written anything worth keeping in months. It used to come easy. Just let the thoughts spill out and see where they took you. Now it feels like dragging stones out of your gut, one by one. You sit down at the table and light the lamp, even though it's not that dark yet. The room is cold, and your coat is still wet from the rain, but you don't take it off. You just sit there, staring at the paper. You know you should make some tea or eat something, but you don't move. Your head is buzzing and your hands feel numb. You pick up the pen and tap it against the table once, twice, just to feel it in your fingers. You thought the walk home would clear your head, but it didn't. It just made everything sharper. It wasn't Khalid's fault. You know that. It wasn't his fault they loved his story. It wasn't his fault they clapped like he'd done something heroic just by living through it, but it made you sick. It made you feel like you'd swallowed something bitter that wouldn't go down. You hate yourself for being angry about it. You hate that you couldn't stay and shake his hand. You know why it bothers you, and you hate that too. It's not Khalid. It's not his speech. It's the way they ate it up and left him nothing but a good story to carry around like a shield. It's the way they like their pain dressed up like something noble, something they can admire without getting dirty. You look at the paper and write without thinking. People like to think of refugees as broken, helpless things. You stop and stare at it. It doesn't feel right. You cross it out and start again. You keep writing and scratching out lines, trying to get it right. You know it's something you've been circling around for years, but you never wanted to pin it down. It's too ugly to look at straight on. It makes you feel mean and small, but it's true, and you can't keep it inside any longer. You pick up the pen again. They like stories about loss and pain because it makes them feel good to feel bad. It's easier that way. You can look at the mess without having to understand it. You can say, "Poor souls," and move on. That's better. That's what you meant to say. You think about how they wanted Khalid to be grateful, to make them feel like they'd saved him. You know that feeling too well. You've been doing it for years, putting on that smile, making your pain look like it meant something. You feel like an idiot now for ever believing it. You write faster, the pen scratching hard against the paper. Some refugees don't just survive, they rise. They turn displacement into power. They learn to use the exile like a weapon, turning themselves into something useful, something needed. It doesn't make them safe. It doesn't make them whole. It just makes them visible. And sometimes that's enough to keep breathing. You stop and rub your eyes. You don't want to sound angry. You just want to make sense of it. You look back down at the paper and keep going, because now it's moving on its own, and you're just trying to keep up. You write about the ones at the top, the refugee elite, the ones who never lost much to begin with, who just shifted their influence from one place to another, the ones who write about exile from clean offices and give speeches at banquets. You write about the aspiring exiled politicians, still talking big from the safety of faraway cities, trying to act like they still have pull back home. You write about the exiled intellectuals, too smart to let themselves bleed on the page, always turning pain into something clever and palatable. You think about the refugee celebrities, the ones they prop up to show the world that surviving is something beautiful. You write about all of them without stopping to see if it makes sense. You just have to get it down. Then you slow down, because it gets harder to think about the others, the ones who never made it out of the mud, the wretched refugees, the ones who are still stuck, still waiting, still watching the world move on without them. They don't get stories told about them. They're just there, half alive, hoping that someone notices. And then there are the asylum seekers, stuck in the in-between, always waiting for someone to decide if they're worth saving. You remember how it felt to be one of them, just a name on a list, just another paper in a pile. You wonder how many of them never made it. You write about the unclaimed refugees, the ones who never found a place to stand, always moving from one temporary shelter to another, slipping through the cracks. You knew a man like that once. His name was Amir. You didn't think about him for years. He just disappeared one day, and no one knew where he went. You wonder if he's still alive. You hope he found somewhere safe. You lean back in the chair and rub your eyes. Your hand aches from gripping the pen too tight, and your back feels like it's been twisted up in knots. You look at the page, lines crisscrossed and words smashed together, some of it barely legible. It doesn't matter. It's there. It's out. You can fix it later. You can make sense of it when your head's not pounding like a drum. You sit there a minute longer, just breathing. The room feels quieter now, like it's finally stopped pressing in on you. You drop the pen on the table, and it rolls off the edge, clattering to the floor. You don't bother picking it up. You just stare at the paper and feel the tightness in your chest start to ease. Then you feel it, the pressure in your bladder that's been building for the last hour while you fought with the words. You push yourself up from the chair, legs stiff, and shuffle to the bathroom down the narrow hall. The toilet's got that yellow ring around the bowl you keep meaning to scrub off, but never do. You lift the lid, lean one hand against the cold tile, and piss like it's the most satisfying thing you've done all day. You hear the rain still battering against the window and look over your shoulder, half expecting Khalid to be standing there, smirking like he used to when he caught you overthinking something. You almost laugh at the thought. You shake yourself off, flush, and head back to the table. The paper's still there, messy and raw. You look at it, and for the first time, you don't feel ashamed of it. You don't feel like it's trying too hard or coming out wrong. It's just honest. You pick up the pen from the floor, sit back down, and scratch one more line at the bottom of the page. Sometimes surviving doesn't feel like a victory. Sometimes it's just what you do because you don't know how to quit. You set the pen down and lean back, stretching out your spine, feeling it crack in a few places. You know it's just a start, but it's more than you've written in months. You think about making some tea, or maybe finding something to eat, but you just sit there a little longer, looking at the mess of words on the paper, and let it be enough for now. You wake up the next morning with a crick in your neck and the taste of stale breath in your mouth. The lamp's still burning low, and the paper's sprawled out across the table like it died there. You can't even remember falling asleep. You rub your eyes and try to make sense of the chicken scratch on the page. You wonder if it'll still make sense in daylight, or if it's just a pile of half-formed thoughts that meant something last night and nothing now. You stand up and stretch, feeling your spine pop like a row of knuckles. The room's cold again, and your feet ache against the bare floor. You pick up the paper and squint at it, tracing the lines with your finger. The words hit different now, like they're too raw, too bare. You feel stupid for spilling it all out like that. You think about crumpling it up and tossing it, but you don't. You just fold it over and put it on the shelf with the rest of the mess you never quite got around to sorting. You light the stove and put on the kettle, trying not to think about Khalid, but he's still there, stuck in your head like a splinter. You wonder if he's still at that fancy hotel they put him up in, eating breakfast with city councilors and college professors. You wonder if he's sleeping in or already out, making rounds, shaking hands with more people who love the story but wouldn't know what to do with the truth. You wonder if he feels like he's telling the truth, or if he's just good at convincing himself it's enough. You don't know. You never knew how to talk to him about it. You never knew how to ask why he made it look so easy when it wasn't. You thought maybe he'd cracked the code, figured out how to wear survival like a good coat that didn't make his shoulders ache. But you know better. You know Khalid isn't that different from you. He just learned to hide the bruises better. The kettle shrieks, and you pour the water into a chipped mug, dropping in a bag of cheap black tea that tastes like dust. You lean against the counter and look out the window, watching the drizzle mist against the glass. The whole street looks washed out and tired, like it's given up on trying to look respectable. Your mind still circling what you wrote down last night, and you know you're not finished with it. You've been pushing it down for too long, trying to act like it doesn't bother you, like it doesn't matter that some people get to stand on stage and tell their stories while others are left to rot in the mud. You know it isn't about Khalid. It's about how the whole damn thing works, how they love the neat stories and throw away the ugly ones. You take your mug to the table and sit down, staring at the blank page you pulled out last night before everything poured out. You know there's more to it than just bitterness. It's not enough to be angry. You have to figure it out, really figure it out, or it'll just keep gnawing at you. You think about how it started. The first time you realized that survival itself was a kind of power. You remember reading about those exiled politicians back at university, how they set up shop in foreign cities and kept talking like they still had a country to go back to. You thought it was noble at first, fighting from abroad, keeping the cause alive. But after a while it just started to feel pathetic, empty. They weren't leading anything. They were just shouting into the void, hoping someone still cared. You remember how it pissed you off when some professor called one of them a hero of resistance, like sitting in a safe apartment and writing angry manifestos was the same as being on the front lines. You almost got kicked out of that lecture for saying it out loud. You didn't care then. You still don't. You didn't understand how people couldn't see through it, how they could talk about courage without having to risk anything themselves. You take a sip of tea and feel it burn down your throat. It doesn't warm you up like it should. You just feel restless, stuck in your own head. You grab the pen and start again, not caring if it makes sense. Exile is a privilege when it keeps you safe. Survival isn't heroic when it's just something you do because there's no other choice. Some people make a life out of it, build something that looks strong from the outside, but it's still made out of the same old rot. The people on top don't see it that way. They think making it out means you've won. They don't get that surviving isn't victory, it's just not dying. The problem is, they've turned survival into a virtue. They've built a whole story around it. The world loves a comeback story, loves to believe that hardship makes you stronger and that suffering builds character. It's an old story, really, one that's been repackaged 1,000 times, slapped on postcards and motivational posters. They need to believe that enduring something terrible means you've become better for it. Otherwise, what's the point of all that pain? What's the meaning of it? If it doesn't make you more resilient, more admirable. They don't see how it's all part of the same system, the way they package human pain into something they can sell. Survival becomes a brand, a way to justify the system that created the suffering in the first place. They need to believe that those who survived somehow earned it, that it's not just luck or chance or sheer stubbornness. They can't stomach the idea that survival is messy and brutal and doesn't mean a damn thing when you're still waking up in cold sweats 30 years later, wondering why it's you who's alive and not the friend who fell beside you. It's ideological. They've built a whole economy around resilience. Every charity dinner, every glossy magazine profile, every panel discussion about refugees, they're not celebrating survival. They're celebrating the idea that the system works, that the world is essentially good, because some people manage to crawl out of hell and make something of themselves. It's a comforting story because it absolves them of guilt. It reassures them that the suffering is somehow fair, that those who didn't make it just weren't strong enough, weren't resilient enough, didn't want it badly enough, It's ideological because it keeps them from facing the fact that survival doesn't mean justice was served. It doesn't mean the world is fair. It just means you were lucky enough not to get hit when the bullets were flying. It means you had just enough breath left in your lungs to make it to the other side. It doesn't mean you're better or stronger or smarter. It just means you didn't die. And that's not heroism. That's not something to put on a pedestal and call noble. They love Khalid because he fits the story they've already written. In their heads, they love that he came out of the fire looking polished and grateful. They need him to be the proof that redemption is possible, that suffering leads somewhere worthwhile. They need to believe that men like Khalid are living proof that the system is fundamentally sound, that hardship only makes you better in the end. That way they don't have to question why the suffering exists in the first place. It's the same story they tell themselves about poverty. They love the rags to riches tales, the ones where the factory worker becomes a millionaire through grit and determination. They never want to hear about the ones who stayed in the gutter, who drank themselves to death because they couldn't crawl out of it. They don't want to talk about the structural rot that made the suffering possible in the first place. They just want the proof that some people made it, because that justifies the rest being left behind. It's the same logic they use to justify war. They look at the soldier who came home with medals on his chest and think it was worth it because someone lived to tell the tale. They don't want to hear about the broken bodies and the wasted lives. They just want the narrative of triumph, of rising from the ashes. They never want to admit that some people just didn't get out, and that surviving doesn't mean you've won anything. It just means you're stuck living with the weight of it. They turn survival into a commodity. They sell the image of resilience because it makes them feel good. It makes them feel like the suffering was justified because it led somewhere. They don't want to hear that surviving broke you in ways that don't ever heal. They don't want to know that some days you wish you hadn't made it out at all, because living with the memories is its own kind of hell. It's ideological because it's easier to believe that suffering has purpose than to face the reality that it's just senseless pain, devoid of redemption. They need to believe in the myth of strength through adversity because it lets them sleep at night, knowing they didn't do anything to stop it. As long as someone survived, they can convince themselves that the world is fair. That hardship builds character and doesn't just grind people down to nothing. It's easier to point to Khalid and call him an inspiration than to look at the men still stuck in refugee camps, waiting for a paper that never comes. It's easier to call him brave than to admit that most people in his place would have given up long ago. They need Khalid to be the symbol of victory over adversity, because it means they don't have to look at the wreckage left behind. It's all part of the same lie. The lie that survival means you've triumphed, that getting out means you're stronger, better, more deserving. It's how they keep the machine running, by holding up the few who made it as proof that the system works, while the rest are buried in silence. The ones who never made it out are forgotten because they don't fit the story. They don't get to stand on stage and talk about hope. They're not part of the myth. Surviving doesn't mean justice was served. It just means you got lucky. It means you crawled through the fire and didn't come out burned to ash. But they don't want to see that. They just want to clap for the ones who made it out clean and call it a victory for humanity. They don't see the rest of us who still have soot in our lungs and dirt under our nails. They don't see the ones still stuck where the bombs fell, where the floodwaters rose, where the guns never stopped firing. They don't want to know that surviving isn't heroic. It's just what's left when giving up wasn't an option. It's just not dying. You stop and chew on the end of the pen. You know you're not saying it right yet. You think about the exiled intellectuals again, the ones who write books about displacement and sell them to universities and humanitarian groups. You remember how one of them came to the university once to talk about the politics of belonging. You hated him on sight. Too clean, too confident, too proud of how he'd turned his suffering into a career. You never asked a question during the Q&A because you didn't trust yourself not to tell him he was full of shit. You look at the words on the page, and it feels like they're trying to slip away from you. You press harder, trying to pin them down. The people who make it don't want to remember what it took to get there. They don't want to admit that it's just luck and timing and the right person giving you a chance. They act like they built something out of nothing. But they just didn't drown when the rest of us went under. They think surviving means they're better than the ones who didn't. They think it makes them something special. You put down the pen and look at what you've written. It's still not right, but it's closer. You're too tired to care if it's pretty. You just need to get it out. You look around the room. Still cold, still cramped, still smelling like old chip grease from downstairs. You know you're not finished. You know this isn't the end of it. You take one more sip of the tea and grimace at how it's gone lukewarm. You set the mug down and lean back, listening to the rain still coming down outside. You know you'll be back at this later, picking it apart, trying to make sense of it. You're not done yet, not by a long shot, but for now, you just let it sit there, raw and messy and honest. Your bladder's complaining again. You get up and head down the hall to the bathroom, not bothering to close the door behind you. You lean one hand against the wall, take a piss, and try to clear your head. You feel a little better, but not much. You flush and wash your hands, wiping them on your jeans because the towel's still wet from yesterday. You go back to the table and sit down, looking at the page like it's a person you don't quite know yet. You tap the pen against the edge of the mug, and it rings like a cracked bell. You know you'll come back to it. You'll keep writing until it makes sense. You just wish it didn't feel so damn heavy all the time. You wish it didn't feel like every word was an accusation. The rain keeps falling, and you just sit there, feeling the quiet settle around you, like a blanket that doesn't warm you up. You know you should move, make breakfast, do something, but you don't. You just sit and think, and listen to the city groaning under the weight of another wet morning.